I wanted to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar on microphone applications for stage and studio. My name is Laura Lawrence, and I'm the Global Marketing Director at Harman. A few things before we get started. Everyone on the call is muted to keep down noise levels during the webinar. There is a chat function where you can submit questions to the presenter, Chris Pyron, and he'll try to answer as many questions as possible. This webinar will be recorded, and the link will be made available tomorrow. We do have a number of other webinars taking place over the next few months for audio, lighting, video, and control. And we'd like to encourage you to take a look at the different webinars in our Learning Sessions workshop series on pro.harman.com, as well as visiting Harman Professional University to see our many on-demand and certification courses that are available to you for free. Now I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Chris Pyron, and he's the presenter for today's webinar. Chris is a business manager here at Harman, and his faith and passion for educating others has led him to spend 10 years becoming an expert in systems design and implementation in worship spaces. He works with clients to design systems that creatively meet all their needs in audio, lighting, media, training, and budget. And now I'll pass the mic over to you, Chris.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Laura. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Really do appreciate you taking the time out of the morning. I wanted to run through a handful of ideas and tips and techniques and things when it comes to miking, whether it be for live application, whether it be for recording application in studio. A lot of these things can be interchanged. Some work better in one application than the other. So I guess we have to start off with asking ourselves the question of, why do we grab the microphones that we grab for certain applications? Is it because it's something we've always done? Is it because we saw a post on Instagram or an article in Live Sound once upon a time and saw somebody mic something a certain way and said, oh, well, I guess that's how I'm going to do it from now on? Did we just experiment around and play with different things and find something that worked well for us? Did we have a mentor who showed us a trick one day and said, oh, that's cool, I'm going to implement that now from now on? So there's lots of different reasons why we grab the things we do. Unfortunately, sometimes we can get stuck in a rut. And I know I had been stuck in a rut for a while with the mic choices I was making and the way I was using them. And had a couple people that I was working with kind of challenge me on some things. I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I'd made some tweaks and some changes. Everything that we're going to talk about today is really big, broad stroke suggestions. Miking can be so subjective on everything. This is just an idea, just sharing some ideas and stuff that I've had that I think could be helpful. So I guess the place we have to start is, what is a microphone? Well, a microphone's a transducer. Well, what's a transducer? The definition of a transducer is simply a device that converts one form of energy into another. So a microphone takes acoustic sonic energy and converts it into electrical energy that can then be processed through a console and through DSP gear, etc. At the other end of that signal chain, we have the big transducers on the end, which are our speakers. They take electrical energy and convert that into sonic energy that then we hear in our ears. But on the front end, we have to capture the sound to get it into the system in the first place. So we use a microphone to convert that sonic energy into electrical energy. Most mics can be divided into one of two categories based on their internal design, right? We have dynamic mics and we have condenser mics. One is not necessarily better than the other, but they do have characteristics that may better suit one over another in certain applications. In reality, any source can be captured by any microphone. Now, having a solid understanding of the microphone's characteristics and how to best deploy it, that's where the art comes into this. We have artists who have worked to create music and hone their craft. It's our job to help them translate that best to the audience, whether it be live, whether it be recording, right? So let's dive in a little bit to the differences between the two types of microphones, between dynamics and condensers. Dynamic mics are the simplest of designs. They create signal through electromagnetic induction. There's a coil of wire called the voice coil that's attached to the lightweight diaphragm, which the diaphragm is displaced by sound energy, sound waves hitting it. This causes the voice coil then to move in the magnetic field created by the magnet. This then creates the electrical output current, which is actually proportional to the amount of sonic energy that comes in. So the louder the sound, the more current we get on the output. This is probably the most common type of mic out there because it is so simple and so easy. Because of the simple, straightforward design, there aren't a lot of parts, and they're relatively low in cost and fairly durable. This kind of makes them a favorite for live sound applications, especially in more rigorous environments like festivals, tours, things along those lines. Condenser mics, they use a little bit more of an advanced design than their dynamic counterparts do. They operate on the principle of electrostatic induction. What this is, this consists of a fixed metal plate called the back plate and a diaphragm, sometimes two, depending on the microphone. So this thin diaphragm is coated in a highly conductive material. Sometimes it's gold, is not uncommon to see. And when sound waves hit that diaphragm, it causes the diaphragm to move back and forth, and that changes the distance between the diaphragm and the back plate. If we go back to our electronics 101 classes and we remember what a capacitor is just two plates that can store a charge, and the closer those plates are, the more capacitance it has. So by changing the distance between the diaphragm and the back plate, that then is what is creating the output current. To generate that current, though, they have to have an external power source to charge the diaphragm and the back plate. This is typically provided via phantom power from our console. Sometimes it's a battery inside the microphone. Sometimes it's an inline phantom injector if we don't have phantom available. Condensers are typically preferred by studio engineers for a number of reasons. They have a tendency to be a little bit smoother sometimes, definitely have a lot of musicality to them. While they are maybe a little less durable than their dynamic brothers, lots of live guys still like to use condensers and do it with excellent results, quite honestly. I'm kind of one of those guys that I reach for condensers for a lot of things, on a live stage, especially around drums, and if I have to do acoustic instruments, things like that, I'm usually reaching for condensers over dynamics because of the additional sensitivity that you can get out of them. So let's dive into polar patterns a little bit and talk about that. A polar pattern or directional response of the microphone shows how the microphone hears or picks up the sounds around it. There really, again, are only two types of microphones. There's omnidirectional microphones and directional microphones. That's it. Now, within that, there are subsets, sure, that we'll dive into a little bit here. Omnis pick up 360 degrees all around the end of the capsule. Directional means that they pick up sounds from one direction and they have rejection in other directions. Directional mics do fall into two more categories. There's unidirectional, like a cardioid, and then there's bidirectional, like a figure 8 that we see sometimes. So when we're looking at mic specs, a lot of times we'll see plots come up like these. This shows the pickup pattern kind of looking straight down. I think of bird's eye view. So you take a microphone, put it on the stand, and then this is going to be your bird's eye view straight down. The first one there on the left is the omnidirectional. If you look at that red circle, it's a perfect circle. So it's going to be picking up equally in 360 degrees all around that mic. Again, kind of envision that softball or beach ball on the end of the microphone. That's going to give you kind of an idea of where that's picking up. Unidirectional cardioid mics have a null on the backside, which rejects unwanted sound, and there's great application for that. There's great reasons to reach for those. A lot of times if we're working, miking a drum kit, for example, I'll reach for cardioids a lot if I'm trying to reject one instrument of the kit out of, trying to isolate one instrument out of that microphone. Hi-hats and snare drums, typically I'll reach for cardioid or sometimes a hypercardioid, depending on where everything's placed, to try and keep the hat out of the snare mic. Bidirectional, figure 8 microphones, they pick up equally well in front and the back, but their nulls are on the sides at the 90-degree point, 90 degrees left and right of the front. Great points of rejection. Again, some really creative uses of these can generate great results while isolating stuff that you don't want to have. So I guess I did mention this earlier. Imagine the sound coming in from the 0-degree point here at the bottom. That's going to be the I'm sorry, guys, chat's going crazy right now. And it keeps popping up in front of me. Laura, is there an annotation window popping up in front of my presentation for you, or is it showing full screen still?
Nope, you're fine.
Okay, great, cool. We're just gonna keep on trucking then. So yeah, like I said, the bird's eye view. So imagine the sound is coming in to that 0 degree mark there at the bottom of the chart. This is the addressable side or end of the microphone. So picking the right polar pattern is really helpful in isolating and rejecting certain sounds in the noisy environment, like a stage or perhaps a live recording in the studio when we have all the musicians come in together. A couple of examples of that would be stage monitors on a stage, or if you have someone in the studio who doesn't want to wear cans or in-ears to monitor back, they would prefer to use live monitors. I know Michael Bublé was big on this for a number of years in the studio. He didn't like wearing cans when he sang, and so his engineer would set up a mono studio monitor in front of him, and he would sing through a cardioid microphone, and they would put the microphone directly in front of the speaker because that's where the cardioid null fell. So it would keep the fold back out of his vocal track. So we want to be really careful though about where we place those monitors, because the last thing we want to do is have that fold back signal or that monitor signal coming back into the microphone, because this is just a recipe for feedback, right? So we need to be aware of the pattern of the mics that we're using and position the monitors accordingly. If we're using a cardioid mic, placing the wedge directly in front of the performer or in front of their mic stand is going to be an ideal placement, as it directs the null of the mic towards the speaker, the part that's going to be rejecting it. Now let's say we're in the middle of sound check and something's going on, and all of a sudden we say, man, this mic just isn't happening. I'm just not loving this. Let's swap a mic. So we grab a different microphone and we throw it up there, and we don't remember that, oh wait, we're moving to a super cardioid or hypercardioid instead of just a standard cardioid mic, and we leave the monitor in the same spot. Well, those hypers and supers, they've got that tail that kind of goes down the handle of the mic, which is cool, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit, because you can get some additional air and some additional characteristics out of the vocal that you might not get with the cardioid. However, we've got to think about where our wedges are. So at that point, we would want to kick our wedges out about 60 degrees left and right, just to make sure that they're folding, that they're playing back into the null of the pickup pattern for that microphone. So I do want to get into this. We can really nerd out today. We can get caught up in looking at text and frequency responses and polar plots and sensitivities and all this stuff. At the end of the day, that's not what we're going into. When it all comes down to it, if nothing else, I want to give you guys permission to experiment, I guess would be the way I would say it. Play with the microphones and the sources. Don't just rinse and repeat and copy what you've seen someone else do and say, well, this is what so-and-so did, so this is what I'm going to do. By all means, try it and see how it works. But remember, your room is different. Your stage is different. Your live room is different. Your instruments are different. It's a different drum. It's a different guitar cab. It's a different guitar player. It's a different drummer. Things are tuned differently. Every vocalist is different, right? You can't say, this is the best vocal mic. This is the best snare mic, the best kick mic, the best whatever mic. There's the best for your application, but there's not just the blanket best for all things. So find out what works for you, okay? Kind of as I alluded to earlier, everything from here on out is a guideline only. It's sort of based on my personal experience over the years, from doing live tour stuff to doing house of worship stuff, some doing studio work and a little bit of everything. I don't claim to have it all figured out. I'm still learning too. I'm a big fan of being a lifelong learner. So take this as just a jumping off point, and again, kind of permission to play around and try some new things that maybe you haven't done before. So before we dive in super far, I have to give props to Michael Stavro here. This is a great book called Mixing with Your Mind. I highly advise everybody who's in the audio industry in any way, shape, or form, whether live, studio, broadcast, whatever, pick up a copy of this. I'm not in any way affiliated with him or with the distribution of this book, but it was one of those things that I picked up a number of years ago, and it really did kind of rock my world a little bit on the way I thought about how I approached my art as an audio engineer. So some of the ideas, I'll be straight up honest with you, some of the ideas we're going to go through today came straight out of this book. He wrote it down, I read it, so I stole it and started using it. So one of the ideas that really hit home for me was the idea of a hardness scale that he talks about in this book. And when looking at an instrument, any instrument, and listening to it, I assign a hardness factor to that sound. So here, these are just some big broad stroke, concepts here, but I think of a kick drum. Kick drum isn't a particularly hard sound typically. Usually it's not a hard sounding instrument. We think round, we think chuffy, we think thump, we think woof, right? We don't think aggressive necessarily. Again, this can change based on the shell, the head, the batter type. Is it a felt beater? Is it a hard beater? Those kinds of things. Bass guitar, kind of the same thing. I kind of keep it down in that 2 to 3 range typically. Sometimes, you might be doing more of a funk thing, a J bass, like really bright, slapping, that's going to get a little bit more aggressive. I'm going to move it up the hardness scale a little bit. Cymbals, another one of those things that pretty subjective here. 7 to 10 is kind of the range I typically start in, depending. If it's something like K darks, I kind of think of those as around like a 7 or an 8. If it's Zildjian A customs, I think of those as like a 14. They just are just so bright and so shiny. A lot of it depends on the player. How are they playing them? What kind of stick are they using? Is it brushes? Is it stick? Is it hot rods? Is it, there's so many variables there. But again, just a concept to start from, an idea to start from. Electric cabinets, again, kind of the same thing. A lot of this depends on the cabinet size. Is it a twin? Is it a 2x12, 4x12? Is it a single? Is it a 1x10? Is it an 8x10 base stack? The Ampeg refrigerators. Again, depends on the player and his guitar choice too. Is he playing a Tele? Is he playing an SG, an LP, 335, a Strat? All these guitars and humbucker versus single coil. All these have different tones to them. So, but typically, again, I'm going to put those a little bit, especially rock and roll guitar. I'm going to put it a little bit more towards the upper end of the scale, the 7 and up. Acoustics, depends on the player and the guitar. Is he playing with a pick? Is it finger pick? Is it a dreadnought, an OM, J45, little parlor guitar? What's the wood? All those kinds of things. But again, somewhere in the middle of the range, 5 to 7, because it is a little bit of a little shinier of an instrument usually. This is probably the most diverse of all when we get into vocals, because we're all over the map. Do you have a low bass who's really mellow, or does he have a little bit of that edge to his voice? You have a female alto, is she really buttery and smooth, or she got that rock and roll growl? So that can kind of slide around. Vocals, in my mind, I always start at a 5, and then I'll move either way, depending on what I hear from them. And typically what I'll do is I'll listen to them, I listen acoustically first, not through microphone. I'll have a drummer sit down and play, and I'll listen to the brass, I'll listen to the kick, and I'll listen to the snare. I'll have the guitar player play and go back and stand by his cabinet and listen and hear what's coming off of that from 4 to 6 feet away. Then, once I've done this with my instruments, then I go through and do the same thing with my mic locker. I'll throw on a pair of headphones that I know really well, and then plug in a microphone and talk into it. I know what my voice sounds like through some of the most popular microphones out there, and so then I can kind of assign a hardness factor as I start comparing my mics together. Ribbons typically wind up on the warmer end of the spectrum, whereas certain small diaphragm condensers can wind up on the harder end of the spectrum. But ribbons and tubes and stuff like that I think of as a softer microphone. So this is where the game begins. The game now at this point is to add up to get as close to a perfect 10 as we possibly can between the instrument and the microphone. So if we go back to our kick drum example, again, 2 to 3, somewhere in there on a kick drum, let's call it a 3 for this example. I'm going to want to reach for something that has a little bit more hardness to it to give it that shape and that definition that I'm looking for. The D112VR is cool because it has a variable frequency response selector switch on it. So if I have a drum that's really dark and woofy, I can throw that switch over to get the high-end boost out of it. And then I've got my 3 and my 7, gets me a perfect 10. It works pretty well. Vocals, again, super all over the map, but let's say I've got somebody who's coming in around a 6. Maybe he's a upper bari, low tenor, has a good bit of presence, maybe a little bit more than, middle of the road. He's leaning a little bit towards the bright side. I'm going to pick a mic that's going to be a little bit warmer or softer. Again, this isn't necessarily frequency response dependent. It's just the sonic signature of that microphone. So in this case, a tube mic could be great, for a studio recording. So 4 and 6 gets me to 10. Cymbals, we're back to brass again, 7, 8, 9, 10, 14 if we're using A's. I'm going to be reaching for something really soft from a mic standpoint. I'm a big fan of large diaphragm condensers. I'm a big fan of ribbons, actually. I think I'm allowed to say that even though AKG doesn't have a ribbon microphone in their inventory right now. I'm still going to say it. So I'm going to reach for a ribbon or an LDC, something like a 121, a 414, XLS probably, something that's going to be a little bit softer and warmer. And again, you put those two together, 2 and 8, gets you that perfect 10. So I do that with every mic, with every input, and just go through the whole mess. So one thing that we have to keep in mind, though, when we start talking about placing the microphones, now that we know what mic we want to start with for a source, the next thing we have to think about is that most instruments were never really intended to be listened to in close proximity the way that we're miking them now. You know, typically instruments are listened to from some distance away, whether it be a few feet to many, many meters. You know, think a few rows back in a concert hall, or at a church, or at an arena for a concert, or even a marching band field where you're many, many, many meters away, you know, in a stadium. So at these distances, the highs, the mids, the lows, the fundamentals, the harmonics, all the different parts of the sonic signature of that instrument have had time to come together and make the sound of the instrument that we know and that we hear. When we're close miking, though, whoops. Got something looping back in my ears here. I'm hearing myself again. So when we're close miking, it's our job as the mix engineer to make sure that we're finding the best balance of all of those different tonal characteristics and recreate the sound that the artist has worked so hard, you know, to produce. So when we think about listening with our ear, like inches from a kick drum, or right next to the grill of a guitar cabinet, or sticking our head inside a grand piano right next to the hammers, how does that sound compared to the way the sound source sounds when we're 6 feet away, 10 feet away, 12 feet away? You know, it's really, really different. So as we mic up an instrument or a vocalist, we have to realize that the diaphragm of that microphone is sampling a very small piece of air, only a few inches away from the source. And we're not capturing the entire picture at that really small point of air where that diaphragm is. So sometimes we can exaggerate certain sonic elements. Sometimes we're forgetting certain sonic elements and they get ignored altogether. So with that in mind, we have to figure out how to place microphones to achieve the right balance to get as close as possible. So what tool do we have that we can use to help us nail that and get it? This thing. We use our ears. There's no, you know, response curves or, you know, doing mic shootouts and smart and looking at transfer function, anything like that, that's going to be more accurate than our ears. Our ears are going to tell us what we like. The human ear is incredibly sensitive to changes in frequency and amplitude. If our eyes had the same resolution and ability to discern minor detail as the human ear does, I've been told that with 20/20 vision, a human should be able to see a quarter on the surface of the moon. If our eyes had that level of sensitivity, which is pretty amazing. So let's talk through some placement stuff, microphone placements. I want to jump in. Let's start with the kick drum, because we know that drums are kind of the heartbeat of the band, right? They're also kind of the most offensive instrument on stage. They're the loudest with snare and cymbals and all that. When we think of a drum kit, are we looking at it as one instrument, or do we look at it as 7 to 10? This is definitely a personal choice question. There's not a right or wrong way to do it. I've spilled many letters of digital ink typing back and forth on this topic with others and wasted a lot of breath, you know, debating merits one way or the other. My personal pick is that I mix it as one instrument. You know, it's one player playing one instrument that just has a lot of parts to it. It's like, is a piano player playing one instrument, or is he playing 88 keys or 88 instruments, you know, in each individual key? So let's jump into the kick drum, since that's kind of the heartbeat and drives everything along. This is kind of my personal pick here on how to mic up a kick. I love the D112 VR. This isn't an AKG pitch, but that's what you're going to see a lot of today. I love the D112 VR for its flexibility, whether I'm doing a jazz kit, whether I'm doing a big 24-inch, you know, massive, you know, rock and roll kick. It just works all the time. Whether you put it just inside the blowhole, whether you put it halfway in the shell, it just gets a great balance of both low end and click and attack and paper that we like off of the front end. In this application, we also have a D112 that is about 3-4 inches off the reso head on the front, and that's just catching the low end woof. Kind of the cool thing about this is that we have built-in EQ control now dynamically. So if we get to a softer passage, we can softer passage of the song, we can bring that inside mic back just a little bit and just let the kick be soft and squishy. When we're really getting to the big chorus and we're driving with full band and we need that kick to cut through the bass and everything else, we can get a little bit more click and paper out of the top end by pushing the inside mic just a hair. So as I'm moving through the drum kit, this is where I differ from some other people that I know. I'll move from the kick drum to the overheads next. Some folks move to the snare, some would do hats, that kind. I go kick to overheads because, again, I think of it as one instrument. So I try and take as few mics as possible to get the picture that I want. And once my kick's locked in, then I'm gonna move up to the overheads and try and capture an overall picture of the entire kit. Big fan of using large diaphragm condensers in figure 8 mode on this. A mono figure 8 overhead is great. It's super simple. There's no phasing or timing issues. Nothing gets weird. It's just a solid overall view of the kit. The way I run my overheads, it's not just a cymbal mic. I like to capture everything. I like to get the toms. I like to get the snare. I like to get the hats, everything. I like to get a good solid picture of everything in the kit. A lot of that has to do with the player and helping the drummer figure out how to not just smash the brass and kill it. So sometimes I do like to do stereo as well. If I'm doing stereo, if I'm mixing on a stereo rig or especially recording, I love to do a pair of 414s in a Blumline configuration, which basically I'll bring in another 414 over the drummer's right shoulder here in this picture, and I'll meet the two 414s head to head, and then I'll rotate them 45 degrees off from each other. So I get something that looks more like this. This is a Blumline configuration, so your elements are rotated 90 degrees. Again, I like doing it in figure 8 mode because I've got the lobe looking down at the drums, and then I also have this other lobe that's looking up, catching what's happening in the air up here. It just has a more open feel to it. It has this air that I just really love. So I'm a big fan of using figure 8s for overheads. Cardioids, fine. If you have a low ceiling or a hard reflective ceiling, by all means, please don't use figure 8. Keep it cardioid so you can reject the splash that you're getting off the ceiling coming back down on top of you. Use it in cardioid mode, but I'm a big fan of using figure 8s here. From here, I move to the drums. I'll move to the snare, toms, that kind of stuff. Lots of miking options here depending on the drum size, shell material, the grain orientation. Is it cross grain? Is it X grain? What are the plies made out of? What kind of head is it? Is it a coated head, a clean head, or a coated or clear, a hazy spot? How are they tuned? All these different things play into it. Again, have them play, stand about 6 feet away, 4 to 6 feet away from the drums while they're playing, and listen to that drum. And then put your cans on, put your ears in, solo that mic channel, and then go over and move that mic around the drum until you can capture that sound that you just heard 6 feet away, or as close as possible. So dynamics have historically been a great for live application just because they do reject so well. I love using dynamics to mic up toms, to mic up snares. However, if given the option and I feel like I can get away with it, I will reach for a cardioid, a large diaphragm cardioid, or sometimes hyper, but usually I just stick with a straight up cardioid for toms because of proximity of everything else, because we've got brass hanging over the top. So I want to have the rejection null of the backside of the mic pointed at the cymbals to try and keep bleed minimized as much as possible. So now, how do we place it? How close do we put it to the drum? In this application where we had a rim clip, it's great. Clip it on. I point the diaphragm right at the center of the head, and right where the stick's going to be hitting. Gives a great balance of attack and tone. Works out really well. If I have it on a free stand or a boom stand of some kind, and I have a little bit more flexibility to move it around, I'll play with it. This is a really cool technique. I'll have whoever's running monitors or front of house, wherever, go ahead and mute that channel, and then I'll actually cut my fingers around the end of the microphone, or the face of the microphone in the case of the 414 that we just saw, and with my knuckles facing the drum. And then I'll take a stick from the drummer, and then I will play that drum at a moderate level, and don't kill it, and don't just tap it, but play the drum. And then what I'll do is I'll move that mic up and down and in and out until I get to that point where I feel the resonance on the back of my hand. And you'll get to that point where just the whole back of your hand lights up. And this picture here says, use the hairs as a Geiger counter to feel the resonance. And there is that point that you get to where the highs, the mids, the lows, everything all comes together. Then I lock off the stand, because that's a good spot to start from. And then I'll go listen. How close is that to what I heard when he was playing it or she was playing it 6 feet away when I was just standing there? So again, good starting place, and then tweak to taste after that. Acoustic guitars, again, we kind of addressed this earlier. There's lots of variables depending on the guitar size and shape and wood and all that. Again, experiment for best results. Your mileage might vary. I like to start with small diaphragm condenser. My personal choice is a cardioid in this application. I'll set the stand right about the 12th fret, somewhere around 9 to 12 inches away. And then I'll rotate it in towards the neck joint, not the sound hole, but the neck joint. This, if I only get to use one microphone, this gives me a nice balance of body and tone. I still get some articulation in there too, because I am looking down towards the fingers and what the fingers have going on. If I get to add a second microphone, I'll reach for a large diaphragm condenser, again, probably cardioid mode, and I'll put it just a couple inches down from the bridge. This adds a nice richness to the overall sound. Turn it left and right. It doesn't have to just be parallel to the body of the guitar. You can actually twist that and turn that, towards the bridge, towards the tail. See what sounds good. See what works out the best. Kind of like the kick earlier, this is kind of built-in EQ, because we've got the bottom end and we've got the top end, and we can sort of blend the two when we need them, whether we need a more present sound or a darker sound. So here's an example of a bass cab that is mic'd up. Lots of times I like to take a DI and a mic and then blend those two together from a bass cabinet. But where do we put the speaker, or where do we put the microphone on the speaker of the cab? Again, so many variables come into play here. If you're right on axis, right in the center of what's called the dust cap, right in the middle, that's going to be probably your brightest spot on the driver. And then as you move out towards the edge, there towards the right, cap edge, cone, and the cone edge, the further out you go, the darker the tone's going to become. It's kind of a good starting spot is right at the edge of the cap and the cone, where the dust cap meets the cone. That's going to give you a pretty good balance. But don't forget, you don't have to stay straight on axis with that grill. You can move that mic off to the side and then angle it in a few degrees to try and catch a balance of warmth and articulation. So the closer you are to center on axis, there in the upper left-hand corner, that's going to be the brightest sound. As you move to the outside edge of that driver, it's going to get more mellow. If you're really woofy, even centered up, and you just have way too much low end in it, it's proximity effect coming into play. And all you have to do is back the microphone off, and it's like a natural high pass. It works great. If it's a little thin, maybe it doesn't quite have all the body you want, push that mic all the way up onto the grill cloth, and that's going to get you some additional bass added back in there. So on guitar cabs, I love to use two mics. I'll go with a dynamic and a large diaphragm. Again, built-in EQ, sparkle, and fat. I get both on the two fingers. A lot of times, if I'm not using an ISO cabinet, I'll go ahead and I'll kick that 414 into figure 8 mode. Again, because we're sampling that small piece of air right next to the driver. If I can sample that air in this lobe that's going on out here too, that's going to sound more natural, because that's more what I hear when I'm standing back listening to the cabinet. Again, our ears aren't accustomed to listening to this stuff 2 inches away. So I'm going to put it out there. I mentioned it earlier, but I'm kind of a fan of this guy too. Ribbons are great, especially on the aggressive guitars. So with that figure 8 pattern naturally occurring with the 121 or other ribbons, it's a great balance of the two. So where do I land? How do I land? Well, I'll start with the mic, with the dynamic first, always, because that's where I'm going to get my articulation, my sparkle, anything that's going to poke through the mix. And then I'll start it on axis in the center of the cone, and then I'll just sweep left and right, go back and forth with it until I find the spot where I feel like I've got the best balance of warmth and articulation. But don't forget, we can also twist and angle the thing too. So sometimes I'll fudge out just a little bit past the dust cap, and I'll turn it and point it back in. Then add in your large diaphragm or your ribbon, whatever you decide to do, and then do the same thing again, and sweep it back and forth until you find the spot that you really like. For me, the ribbon or the LDC usually winds up just a little bit further off the dust cap. I like it to just be the fat channel. I like all the meat to come through that. So I'm usually an inch or two past the dust cap. I'm not usually sitting right on top of it. So let's take a look at taming this beast. Again, is it one instrument or 88 instruments? It's definitely one instrument. But when you think about this instrument being played and we're listening to it, sound radiates from all over this thing. We have hammers hitting the strings that resonate the harp, that makes the wood vibrate, that bounces off the floor and the wall and the lid. You know, if the lid's open, all these things before it finally comes out and hits our ears. And we've been asked to figure out how to recreate that sound with 2 3/4-inch capsules. You see the challenge again, right? We're sampling tiny pieces of air trying to get a big picture. So one very popular technique is to use a pair of omnidirectional small diaphragm condensers. This works really great. Set them a few inches back away from the hammers, spaced out 2 feet, 3 feet, somewhere in that range, maybe 6 to 9 inches above the strings. It's a really great balance. By moving the mics forward and back, we can get more attack, or we can get less attack and a little bit of a warmer sound. By having the mics split like this, again, we kind of get a little bit more of that built-in EQ control because we have some high strings and we have the low strings. So we can get that extra articulation out of it when needed. Sometimes, though, we don't have this luxury. We can't rip the lid off the top of it. In the studio, we can. Typically, it's not a big deal. But in live applications, they don't even like having the stick up, and having the lid open on stage because it could cause, aesthetic issues. You can't see the back line behind them or obscuring the video wall or something like that. So sometimes we can't open up the lid, right? So in stage settings, what are we going to do? Well, I'm kind of a fan of using PZMs or boundary microphones. We didn't really dig into a boundary mic. A boundary mic is a cardioid microphone, but it's only half the pattern of the cardioid, if that makes sense. So if you take the cardioid shape, that heart shape, and just cut it in half, and it's all coming off the front of that microphone. There's just nothing behind it. That's probably the quickest and easiest way to explain it. But I'll take that and affix that to the inside of the lid. I'll try and get it as close to the center of the harp as possible. Kind of right where the strings cross is a good spot to shoot for. This gives a really good balanced tone. Doesn't quite have the same flexibility that we get with the 2-mic approach we talked about just a minute ago, because it is only one mic, but you could do that. If you want a really, really dark tone, you could throw a large diaphragm condenser all the way down to the tail of the piano looking back up. But this is a great result nonetheless. You can affix it to the inside of the lid, close the lid, and it gives you a really good, well-balanced piano sound here. So that's just a handful of things. I do want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for Q&A through the chat. I've been trying to keep half an eye on it, guys. I promise I have, but I haven't been doing a great job keeping up, so I'll apologize for that. If anything, though, I want to finish sort of where we started. If anything, I want to give you permission to play around, experiment with this stuff. Grab a microphone, plug it in, try it, see how it works. Is it a great result? Awesome, keep it. Is it a poor result? Great, go grab another microphone. There's nothing that says that you can't mic a kick drum with a small diaphragm or large diaphragm condenser. Try it. Just play around with it, experiment, see what works for you. So I did want to put my email address on here. I'm going to get out of Keynote here in just a second so I can look back at the chat window. But here's my contact info. I would love to hear from you if you've got questions, comments, have any discussion that you want to have about a specific application. I'd be happy to dive into that with you. But yeah, so Laura, I'm going to turn it back over to you while I get out of Keynote here real quick so I can look at the chat window.
Yeah, I actually have a few that came in, if you don't mind me reading those out to you.
Go for it.
The first one is, do you have any advice for podcaster miking techniques and using the AKG Lyra like you're using in this webcast?
Oh, well, look at that. Hey, plug for the AKG Lyra. The biggest thing I could tell you from a podcaster standpoint is going to be control your environment as much as possible. I'm actually doing this from my house because I can't go to the office right now, like probably most of you. One thing I'm making sure to do is I'm keeping my gain really, really low on the Lyra to keep reflections from the room minimized as much as possible, and then I'm direct monitoring with my headphones straight off the bottom of the mic. Also, polar patterns, like we just talked about, super important to probably keep it rocking in cardioid mode for the most part. Distance to the sound source is going to be huge too. As you can see, I've got this thing right up next to me. I've got a boom stand. If it was down on the desktop, it would definitely be way more ambient. So trying to minimize, again, all the reflections and the sounds of the room as much as possible. So.
Okay, the next question, can you talk about the differences in SPL sensitivity of different mics in different applications?
Ooh, yeah. So sensitivity is one of the things I kind of glossed over earlier with the dynamic versus cardioid comparison. The sensitivity of the microphone is how quickly does it respond to a sound source? How much of a sound source does it take for it to actually move the diaphragm and generate a certain amount of signal on the backside? Condensers have a secondary circuit built into them because typically they generate a very low current, and then there's a secondary circuit that kind of amps that current up for our input purposes then into our console. Sensitivity is huge to be looking at and thinking about. One of the cool things with condensers is that we say they are more sensitive. That's based on the fact that if you look at an impulse response as it hits a condenser versus a dynamic is you're going to see the impulse, and then it's going to take a little bit for it to finally get back to a point of stasis. With a condenser, because it does have just that mylar diaphragm, it can respond much quicker, and then it gets back to that 0 point much faster. So it's ready then for the next impulse really quickly. So it's going to have faster impulse response and recovery time, making it more sensitive and more articulate sometimes is kind of the word that you'll hear thrown about for that. So.
Okay, next question. Would miking up an amp cause feedback?
Would miking an amp cause feedback? Usually I haven't had that situation occur, no. Usually I'll mic it out or mic it up and then route it through the console or house. Yeah, I haven't ever had that issue. I suppose, I guess if you were in an application where you had like really, really rocking foldbacks, like really, really loud stage wedges that were blowing back, potentially, but usually I haven't had feedback scenarios with miking up amplifiers, no.
Okay, another question. Are you a fan of Omni or Uni Lab mics on body packs for theater?
Oh, that's so loaded. Just like everything else we've talked about today, it depends. It really does. I personally prefer the sound of Omnis when it comes to micros, whether it be headsets or lavs. Again, is it clipped to a lapel? Is it in a hairline? Is it on a headband? Right on the forehead? How close are my vocalists going to be to each other? How close are the performers together? If they're getting within close proximity, maybe singing in a chorus part together, something like that, I'm probably going to reach for cardioids just to try and keep everybody a little bit more isolated, because you put a bunch of Omni mics together and then have everybody stand shoulder to shoulder and sing, you're going to have crosstalk, you're going to have bleed, and then things get phasey and can get really weird. So again, it kind of depends on the application. If I've got people spread way out all over the place, sure, I'll reach for Omnis and no foldbacks, depending on what the monitoring scenario is like. But most of the time, I'm going to reach for Omnis first, and then I'll go to cardioids or hypers if I need to for damage control.
Okay, the next question is, can you speak at all about dual element mics? I have a few very old AKG D200s that I would love to learn to use better.
Oh, yeah, I saw that one pop up. That was Ryan, wasn't it? Yeah, so Honestly, Ryan, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not super familiar with the D200. I will have to look into that one specifically and get back to you. One dual element that I can speak to that I'm like really familiar with is, sorry, it's the Royer SF12, but it's a stereo ribbon. It comes with the elements rotated. I believe it's 40 degrees. I don't think it's full 90 degrees. I think it's 45 degrees off of each other, so you get a 90-degree field off of it. But I'll usually reach for those for stereo miking applications. Overheads works great. You can just run one right over the top of your kit. Choir mics, it's actually kind of one of my favorite choir applications too. If I'm in a controlled environment, a highly reverberant space, not so much. But Ryan, send me an email with your contact info, and I would love to dig into that D200 with you a little bit and figure out some fun ways to play with it. So.
Okay, we've got a bunch more. What is your advice for miking a lapel for an open room with lots of echo?
Try really hard to get them to use a handheld. Man, yeah, that's a tough one. Lapels are tough. It's a proximity to the sound source issue at that point, because instead of being able to get a head worn where I can put the element right next to their cheek, or right on their cheek, right next to their mouth, where we're talking an inch of distance, now you're talking many, many inches of distance, and now you're sounding like this and getting all this extra room noise and reverb from the room, and depending on how well the PA is controlled and the pattern of the PA. That's a tough one. I would probably tell you first and foremost, lean towards cardioid instead of omnis to try and mitigate as much additional stuff coming back into the microphone as possible. Get that thing as high as you can, as close to the speaker's mouth as possible, without being detrimental to the overall sound. You don't want to get it so high that you're just getting throat and you lose all the articulation. But try and get it as high as you can and as close to their mouth as possible. If you can have the conversation about a head worn, or the microlight headsets, whether it's AKG microlights, Countryman's, DPAs, I mean, everybody's got these little teeny tiny headsets that don't show up. Pastor might feel, I'm guessing this might be a church application, since I know there are a lot of churches that use lapels and are in highly reverberant rooms. If it is a pastor scenario and he's afraid he's going to feel like Justin Bieber, Garth Brooks, Britney Spears, I've heard it all, all those. I don't want to be Garth Brooks. Well, you don't look like Garth Brooks. You're not wearing a Crown CM312 AE, great big in front of your mouth. It's, way smaller. It's micro, and it is flesh colored. People in the fourth row can't see it. So if you can have the headset discussion, that's a great spot to start. If he's just dead set on having to stick with a lapel, then go with the cardioid and get it as close to his mouth as possible. So.
Okay, next question. Do you do time alignment of the mics, for example, on the kick drum, and how?
Yeah, okay. So this is fun. I will time align my drums to the nth degree, but I have to figure out where 0 is. What am I time aligning to? Am I time aligning to the snare? Am I time aligning to the kick? Am I time aligning to the rack tom? What am I time aligning to? For me, I will time align my two, if I'm using an inside and an outside, the kick example that we had earlier, we had two mics kind of on the outside of the drum, one in the hole, one listening to the reso. If I have a scenario where I go all the way inside the drum and then I've got one on the outside, I will time align those, and I will go ahead and back up the inside to match up the outside. And so those are going to be coherent all the time. Everything else, I time align to my overheads. So I will measure from my snare drum to my overhead and say, okay, that's the time and that's the delay I'll put in for the snare. And then I'll do the same thing for each individual tom and delay those to match the overhead as well. So overhead is 0, that's going to be 0 time, and then you want to delay your individual drums up to that, and that's just that's math, right? Pull out a tape measure, measure it, and then figure out how many milliseconds. I mean, I'm nerd out and do like 3.83 milliseconds to the snare or something silly like that, I think is what I saw in my last show file.
Okay, here's another question. How big of an influence is the quality of the cable?
Yeah, it definitely has an influence for sure. Don't use coat hangers. However, on the other side of that spectrum, don't go out and buy silver cables. I know a number of studio engineers who have purchased silver cables. And one of them, who's a guy in Nashville, heard an interview with him, and he has his silver cable that he bought and paid some obscene amount of money for a 15-foot cable. He keeps it coiled up hanging on the door to the studio behind him, and he keeps it coiled up hanging there to remind him to never waste money on a silver cable again. Buy good solid cables, but whether I'm not going to throw any names out there because then it sounds like I'm playing favorites, but any reputable cable manufacturer out there is going to get you, a good solid cable, whether it be, well, I said I wasn't going to name names, but yeah, use quality cables with quality connectors, please.
Okay, here's another one. What is the main difference between AKG D5 and D7, and are they reliable for a studio registration?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, of course. D5 and D7, you're going to have different pickup patterns on them. One's cardioid, one's supercardioid. Similar in frequency response. The 7, I actually like the 7 a little bit better for vocals, if it's the right vocal. I will say that. If there are certain vocals I wouldn't throw it on. But yeah, of course, I would always throw a pair of those into a studio locker just as another dynamic alternative, if nothing else, right? We all know that really famous dynamic mic that we see all the time that has a really round top. Surely you know who I'm talking about here. Yeah, why not throw additional dynamics into the mix to be able to play with? Because everything has a slightly different sonic signature to it. So.
Okay, next question. When adding 2 mic configurations during live, one being dynamic and the other being condenser, how would you pan them in live sound, considering they will have very different sonic signature, or do you keep both mics in mono?
I'm going to guess this is in regards to the guitar miking, I guess the guitar cabinet mic thing that I did. This actually dives further into a mixing kind of thing. Then I keep them both mono. That's the short answer. And then I'll use the LDC. I'll use the 414 as more of the rhythm sound, and then when I need that lead sound, go ahead and push the dynamic in to get it to poke through the mix a little bit more for lead. So.
Okay, what is the best mic for a choir that is performing in the center of a basketball court? They've been using KSM 9s with mixed results, getting low gain before feedback.
A choir using KSM 9s. Yeah, I would probably look into maybe a shotgun capsule of some kind. So we didn't get into this, but a shotgun falls into the unidirectional condenser category. So I would probably look into some shotgun elements to be able to get all that energy focused forward and anything on the sides and back to be rejected out as much as possible. I would probably start there. If I was in a basketball court, because golly, that's just a reverb tank. Yeah, I would start there.
Okay, next question. How do you deal with phase issues while both snare top mic and snare bottom mic are used? Are there any other techniques in addition to inverting polarity?
And making sure they're the same distance from their respective heads, right? I mean, the snare drum is going to, by nature of the way it works, is going to have some phase issue anyway, because we have the stick hitting the top, and when we have a rarefaction negative pressure wave on the top head while we have a positive pressure wave on the bottom head. That's the reason that we flip the phase of one or the other of the microphones. But because of that little bit of time that it takes for that pressure to move through, I mean, we're talking fractions of a millisecond, right? But making sure that mics are the same distance from the head as much as possible, number one. Number two, using high pass and low pass filters, usually high pass filters in the case of an under snare mic, so you don't have that phase issue in the low mids and the lower frequencies. Most of the time we're just putting the under snare mic in there to get that extra rattle and sparkle out of it. So I'll just high pass it, stupid high, 1K even, and that way any phase issues that are going on in the low mids and lows are negated because you're not reproducing it in two different channels that way. So.
Okay, you ready for a few more?
Sure, let's keep going. I'm good.
Okay. In terms of vocals with backup vocalists, what's your take on this in terms of microphone choices? Any difference in types of microphones with lead vocals and backup vocals?
Nope. It's what's the right microphone for the vocalist. What mic sounds the best for the vocalist? I am going to name one name, and I'll tell you, and I'm going to put it out there, and micrentals.com. Check those guys out. They're super cool. You can rent a microphone from them, play with it for a weekend or a week, and try it out. Get a handful of different mics and play with them and see what works for your vocalists. Listen to them as they sing acoustically 3 feet away from you, and again, assign them that hardness thing, the hardness factor, and then pick some mics and just try stuff out, and try all the mics. If you can rent it for a weekend and play around, it's worthwhile to get the right mic tested, and then you know what to pick for that vocalist. We have different capsules for different vocalists. I'll speak to my church specifically. The worship leader has a different capsule than the keys player, different capsule than the electric player, different capsule than the drummer. I mean, everybody has a different capsule on the stage. They all have different vocal qualities and vocal traits. I want the best mic for each of them. So play around and test it out. I wouldn't say that backups need this mic, leads need this mic. I would say get the right mic for the vocalists and go with that. And then now EQ choices, once you're building the mix, yes, there will be some differences there for sure. Maybe take some of the meat and a little bit of sparkle out of the backup vocals while you still get a really nice full range out of the lead. But that's a mixing conversation, not a miking conversation.
Okay, next question. On a drum kit, most use overheads over the cymbals. Have you had any experience from miking the cymbals from the underside? Yeah, and I didn't like it. I have not had good experiences doing that. Again, because I don't listen to a cymbal with my ear 2 inches away underneath it. I listen to a cymbal standing 6 feet away from the kit. So when I have tried to do that, it felt really unnatural to me. It didn't have that open airiness to the top end of the kit. And quite honestly, by throwing up overheads in that blum line configuration right over the snare, I did the blum line thing right over the snare drum. Kind of draw a line down a diagonal line down the middle of the kit and do the blum line thing with the two 414s knocked out 90 degrees from each other. That's been the best that I've found, other than trying, miking underneath the cymbals didn't work for me. So. Okay, it looks like we've reached our time. There are a few other questions. I would recommend that anybody who didn't have their question answered, reach out to Chris with the email address that he provided, chris.tyron@harman.com.
Actually, I do see one in here. I know we're at time, and we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. But
sure.
The individual who asked about miking Indian drums, please drop me an email. I did this a few months ago, and I found a really cool trick. So drop me an email. I would love to have a conversation with you about that. So.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Chris, for presenting. This was really great information. The recording for this will be sent out tomorrow, so if anybody on your team or friends might have missed it, feel free to pass the recording to them.